A house is more than just timber and nails. It is a repository of memory, a physical manifestation of a life well lived. And as I lay in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to the murmuring voices drifting up through the floorboards, I realized my home was about to become a battleground. I knew every inch of this place. I knew the way the third stair creaked if you didn't step on the far left edge. I knew the specific, mournful whistle the wind made when it pushed against the sash window in the library during a storm. I knew exactly where Clara had thrown that plate of spaghetti in 1984, leaving a faint, almost imperceptible stain on the plaster that I refused to paint over because it reminded me of her fire. I am Henry Cobb. I am 85 years old. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer, designing bridges that could withstand earthquakes and skyscrapers that could sway in a hurricane without breaking. I know about stress points. I know about load-bearing walls. And for the last 6 months, since my hip shattered and my independence fractured along with it, I had been watching the structural integrity of my family disintegrate. Julian and Beatrice had moved in under the guise of mercy. "We'll take care of you, Dad," Julian had said, his eyes wet with a sincerity I desperately wanted to believe. At first, it was a relief. The house had felt too large since Clara died, the silence too heavy. But the care quickly curdled into containment. They didn't treat me like a father. They treated me like a squatter who had overstayed his lease. They stopped asking me what I wanted for dinner and started telling me what I could eat. They spoke to me in that high, patronizing tone people reserve for toddlers and the very old, as if my hearing aids were also filters for intelligence. But my hearing was fine, better than fine. It was the only sharp thing I had left. It was Tuesday, raining hard, a relentless gray wash against the windows. I was in bed, pretending to nap, nursing the dull, grinding ache in my hip that signaled a storm. The heating vent in the corner of the room acted like a primitive intercom, carrying sound from the kitchen directly to my bedside. "No, the old man doesn't know." Julian's voice floated up, distorted but distinct. It wasn't the voice he used with me. It was stripped of the fake warmth, dripping with a cold, metallic contempt that made my skin crawl. "We're not listing it. We're tearing it down."
"I spoke to the developer yesterday. The lot is worth triple without the structure. It's a tear-down, Bea. But what about the—" Beatrice's voice was lower, anxious. "The stash. We just need to find it first," Julian replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "Mom wasn't lying. She told me when I was 10. She said Dad hid gold in the walls during the inflation crisis in the 80s. He was paranoid about the banks. It's in there somewhere, behind the plaster." I lay there, frozen, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of a country that didn't exist. Gold. There was no gold. It was a joke, a metaphor. Clara used to tell it at dinner parties after a few glasses of wine. It was her way of talking about the sweat equity, the weekends I spent rewiring the den, the nights I spent sanding the banister until my hands bled. But Julian, blinded by his own failures and drowning in debt I wasn't supposed to know about, had twisted a metaphor into a lottery ticket. He wasn't just planning to evict me. He was planning to demolish my life's work, to shatter the very walls that held my memories, all to hunt for a phantom fortune. If you've ever realized that the people you raised, the people whose diapers you changed and whose tuition you paid, are just waiting for you to become a past tense verb so they can cash out your life, you know the cold fire that started burning in my gut right then. It wasn't rage. Rage is hot and messy. This was cold. This was structural. If you're listening to this, don't make the mistake of thinking blood is thicker than greed. Subscribe now, because I decided in that moment that if they wanted to find gold, I would give them a treasure hunt that would cost them everything they had. I didn't confront them. I didn't storm downstairs and scream. I went silent. I played the part they had written for me.
I became the confused, compliant invalid. When Beatrice brought me my lukewarm soup, I let my hand shake so much I spilled it on the duvet. When Julian shoved legal papers in front of me, transfer deeds, power of attorney forms, I signed them with a trembling scrawl, pretending my eyes were too watery to read the fine print. "It's just for the insurance, Dad," Julian lied, not even looking me in the eye. "Okay, son," I whispered, my voice thin and reedy. "They told me on Thursday. They were moving me to Sunny Acres on Monday."
It was a state-run facility on the edge of town, a warehouse for the forgotten, where the air smelled of bleach and despair. They framed it as a luxury. "It has a garden, Dad," Beatrice chirped. I nodded. I thanked them. That gave me 3 days. I waited until they were asleep on Friday night. The house settled into silence, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I called Saul. Saul was my foreman 30 years ago. He was a man made of granite and loyalty, with hands the size of shovels and a heart that never forgot a favor. I had saved his business in '95 when the economy tanked, covering his payroll out of my own pocket so his men wouldn't starve. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was rough with sleep. "No, Saul," I said. "I need a job done." He arrived at 2 a.m., slipping through the back garden gate like a ghost in workboats. He didn't ask questions when I met him at the back door, leaning heavily on my cane. He just looked at my face, saw the grim set of my jaw, and nodded. We went to the basement. It smelled of damp earth and old paint. I pointed to the wall behind the ancient boiler. It was a false partition I had built years ago to access the pipes, covered in drywall that looked solid but could be pried loose. "Open it," I said. Saul used a pry bar. The drywall popped free with a groan. "What's in there?" Saul asked, peering into the dark cavity between the studs. "The truth," I said. I handed him the box. It was a heavy iron lockbox I had dug out of the attic. I had rubbed it with oil and dirt to make it look ancient. Inside there was no gold. There was a single red clay brick wrapped in oilcloth to give it weight, and a thick cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. "Put it in there," I ordered, deep. Saul placed the box in the wall. He reattached the drywall, sealing it up, then rubbed dust over the seams until they were invisible. "Now the bait," I whispered. We went up to the study. I pulled my old leather-bound journal from the shelf, the one I knew Beatrice snooped in when she thought I was sleeping. I turned to the entry for October 12, 1982. I took a red pen. I circled the date. Then at the bottom of the page I wrote a lie. I made my handwriting shaky, mimicking a man under stress. "The inflation is eating us alive," I wrote. "I don't trust the banks anymore. They'll take it all. I have converted the savings. It is in the walls now, safe from the banks, safe from everyone."
I left the journal open on the desk, casually, as if I had been reminiscing. Saul left before dawn. I sat in my chair and waited. Morning came with the sound of Beatrice making coffee. The vacuum cleaner roared for a minute, then stopped abruptly. Silence. Then, a gasp. I imagined her reading the words. I imagined the dollar signs spinning in her eyes. She didn't tell Julian immediately. I watched her from the hallway as she moved through the house, clutching the journal in her apron pocket, touching it like a talisman. She kept the secret for an hour, savoring it, letting the greed marinate. Then she dragged Julian into the pantry. I heard the fierce, urgent whispering. "In the walls, Julian. He wrote it down, 1982. Julian's voice was high, tight. They emerged from the pantry, vibrating. They looked at the walls of my house not as shelter, but as a piggy bank they were itching to smash. They looked at me with a new, terrifying hunger. I wasn't just an obstacle anymore. I was the keeper of the map. They moved the timeline up. "Dad," Julian said on Sunday afternoon, his face flushed, "we got a call from Sunny Acres. A room opened up early. The best room." I asked, looking at my dinner plate. "We packed for you," Beatrice said, pointing to a single suitcase by the door. It was small. It held my old clothes, the ones I wore to garden in. They hadn't packed my suits. They hadn't packed my photos. "It's for the best," Julian said, checking his watch. He was bouncing on the balls of his feet. The house is dangerous, Dad. The structure is failing."
They drove me to the facility in silence. The car ride felt like a funeral procession for the living. They walked me to the front desk, signed the papers with a flourish, and patted me on the shoulder. "We'll visit," Julian lied. "Get some rest," Beatrice said, her eyes already distant, already back at the house, imagining the sledgehammer in her hand. They left. I watched through the glass doors as they practically ran to the car. I turned to the nurse at the desk. She looked tired. "Mister?" she asked. "I won't be staying," I said. She blinked. "I'm not checking in," I said, my voice firm, the voice of the engineer who built skyscrapers. I walked out the side door. Saul was there in his truck, the engine idling. "Ready?" he asked. We drove back to the neighborhood. We parked 3 streets down, in the shadow of an oak tree.
We sat in the dark cab of the truck, watching the house through a pair of high-powered binoculars. The lights were blazing in every window. It looked like a ship on fire in the night. "They didn't wait," Saul noted. "No," I said. I closed my eyes for a second, picturing the inside of the house. I pictured the crown molding I had installed by hand. I pictured the wainscoting in the dining room. I pictured the life I had built, board by board. "Give me the tablet," I said. Saul handed me the iPad connected to the hidden cameras we had installed along with the box. I turned it on. The screen flickered to life. Julian was standing in the living room. He was holding a sledgehammer. He wasn't wearing safety goggles. He wasn't wearing a mask. He was wearing his expensive loafers and a look of pure, unadulterated avarice. "Beatrice!" screamed from the kitchen. She was tearing at the wallpaper with her bare hands, her manicure ruined, her face streaked with dust. Julian swung the hammer. Crash! Plaster exploded, lath splintered. Dust plumed into the air, coating the furniture they hadn't even bothered to cover. I watched my son destroy my home. I watched him swing the hammer again and again, grunting with exertion, his face twisted into a rictus of greed. He smashed through the drywall. He ripped out the insulation. He was dismantling his inheritance, reducing $1 million asset to a pile of rubble, driven by a lie I had fed him. It was horrifying. It was like watching an autopsy on a body that was still warm. But it was necessary. They had to be the ones to hold the hammer. They had to be the architects of their own ruin. I watched the screen, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. "Keep going," I whispered, because when they found the box, the real demolition would begin. And it wouldn't be the house that collapsed. It would be them. I didn't stay at Sunny Acres for more than an hour. The smell of institutional beef stew and antiseptic was a reminder of a future I wasn't ready to accept. And besides, I had a front row seat to a demolition I had orchestrated. Saul was waiting for me around the corner, his truck idling in the shadow of a street lamp, the engine purring with a low, steady rumble that felt like reassurance. We drove back to the old neighborhood in silence. The streets were quiet, lined with houses that were dark and sleeping, unaware of the violence happening in their midst.
We parked 3 blocks down, tucked behind a massive oak tree that shielded us from view, but gave us a clear line of sight to my home. It was blazing. Every light in the house was on, blazing with a manic, desperate energy. It looked like a ship on fire in the middle of a dark ocean, a beacon of destruction. "They didn't wait," Saul murmured, passing me the tablet. "No," I said, taking the screen. I looked down at the feed. The hidden cameras Saul had installed alongside the lockbox were transmitting a crystal-clear image of the carnage. It was worse than I had imagined. Julian was in the living room. He had stripped off his dress shirt and was wearing a white undershirt soaked through with sweat. He held a sledgehammer in his hands, his knuckles white, his face twisted into a rictus of exertion and avarice. He wasn't just hitting the walls, he was attacking them. He swung the hammer with a violence that spoke of years of repressed anger, of entitlement denied. Crash! The head of the hammer smashed through the plaster above the fireplace. Dust exploded into the room, a white cloud that coated the mahogany mantel I had carved myself. "Beatrice!" screamed from the kitchen. She was tearing at the wallpaper with her bare hands, her manicure ruined, her face streaked with dust and sweat. She looked feral. "The journal said south!"
I watched my son destroy my home. I watched him rip out the crown molding I had installed with my own hands in 1978. I watched him smash through the lath and plaster, exposing the ribs of the house, looking for a treasure that didn't exist. He was dismantling his inheritance, reducing $1 million asset to a pile of rubble, driven by a lie I had fed him. It was horrifying. It was like watching an autopsy on a body that was still warm. But it was necessary. They had to be the ones to hold the hammer. They had to be the architects of their own ruin. "Keep going," I whispered to the screen. They moved like a plague through the house. The dining room, the hallway, the master bedroom. They ripped up floorboards. They shattered mirrors. They were destroying the very thing they claimed to want, blinded by the promise of easy gold. At 3 a.m., they reached the basement. The camera feed switched to the low-light mode. The basement was a dusty, shadowed cavern. Julian stumbled down the stairs, dragging the sledgehammer behind him. Beatrice followed, holding a flashlight that shook in her hand.
"Behind the boiler," Julian gasped, wiping sweat from his eyes. "That's where the false wall is." He didn't need blueprints. He needed greed. He swung the hammer. Thud. The drywall crumbled. It wasn't built to withstand assault. It gave way easily, revealing the dark cavity behind the boiler. The heavy iron lockbox tumbled out. It hit the concrete floor with a sound that was heavy and promising, a dull, metallic clunk that echoed in the silence. "Julian!" yelled. His voice cracked with hysteria. He dropped the hammer and fell to his knees. "I found it! Beatrice!" Beatrice scrambled down the stairs. They huddled over the box like vultures over a carcass. They were panting, sweating, their eyes wide with the reflection of a fortune that didn't exist. "Beatrice!" shrieked. Julian jammed the crowbar under the lid. He heaved. The old lock, weakened by rust and time, snapped with a sharp report. He threw the lid back. They froze. Inside the box was a single object wrapped in oilcloth. It was heavy. It was the size of a gold bar. Julian reached in. His hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped it. He pulled it out. He unwrapped the cloth. It was a brick, a standard red clay brick. The silence in the basement was absolute. It was the silence of a universe collapsing. "Beatrice," whispered. "Where is it?" Julian frantically dug through the box. He threw the oilcloth aside. He felt around the bottom. His hand closed on something else. An envelope. He ripped it open. He tore the paper in his haste. He pulled out the documents. I zoomed in on the camera feed. I knew exactly what they were reading. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a bank code. It was a deed transfer and a letter. "To my son," Julian read aloud. His voice was trembling, thin and reedy in the damp air. "The gold you are looking for is the house itself." He stopped. He looked at Beatrice. "Beatrice!" she screamed. "This property was placed in a specialized historic preservation trust 3 days ago." Julian continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The terms of the trust state that the house is to remain standing in perpetuity." He paused, joking on the dust and the realization. "The clause states," he read, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "that any intentional structural damage inflicted by the beneficiaries prior to my death voids their claim to the trust entirely." Beatrice snatched the paper from him. Her eyes scanned the legal text, desperate for a loophole, for a mistake. Restoration. We destroyed it. The second document, I whispered in the truck. Julian saw it. It was underneath the letter. He pulled it out. It was a printout of the demolition permit application they had forged with my signature just 2 days ago. Below it was a cease and desist order from the Historical Society, which I had triggered the moment the permit hit the system. "We committed a felony," Julian whispered. He sank back onto his heels, the brick still sitting on the floor next to him, mocking him. "We destroyed a protected landmark, and we don't own it." "The sirens," I said to Saul. Saul nodded. He had made the call 10 minutes ago. In the distance, the wail of sirens cut through the night. It grew louder, a rising tide of consequence. I watched through the binoculars as the police cruisers pulled up to the curb. The lights flashed red and blue, painting the ruined house in a chaotic strobe. The neighbors were out on their lawns now,
wrapped in bathrobes, watching the spectacle. Julian and Beatrice stumbled out of the front door. They were covered in white dust. They held crowbars. They looked like ghosts, or vandals, or fools. The house behind them was a ruin. The windows were smashed. The walls were gaping wounds. They had destroyed a $1 million asset, looking for a pot of gold that was never there. The police officers approached them. I saw Julian trying to explain. He was pointing at the house, pointing at the box, waving his hands. The officers weren't listening. They were looking at the unauthorized demolition of a historic home. They were looking at the weapons in their hands. They were cuffing them. I watched as my son was pushed into the back of a squad car. I watched as Beatrice was led away, weeping. I lowered the binoculars. "Let's go, Saul," I said. "Where?" Saul asked, starting the engine. "To the lawyer's office," I said. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a heavy, quiet peace. I had lost my house, yes. It was gone, a casualty of their greed. But I had regained my dignity. I had proven that my legacy wasn't something they could steal. It was something they had to earn, and they had failed the test. I live in a small condo now, near the ocean. It's quiet here. The walls are solid. Saul visits on Sundays, and we drink coffee on the balcony. I don't have gold in the walls. I have peace in my heart. And somewhere, in a cell or a courtroom, my son is finally learning the value of what he broke.